We all love trees and enjoy studying forests and their human inhabitants. That's the reason why we're gathered here. Towering trees, lianas of high canopy, pristine, mature forests are a potent symbol of global conservation of biodiversity. Conservation groups organize huge fundraising campaigns around alternating provocative images of the pristine and projections of gloom and doom. Smiling natives are often included in promotional imagery as benign stewards, and in other cases as degraders of environments, as pointed out earlier by Roderick Newman. My simple point here is to talk about the complex human histories of some forests that I'm familiar with in the Bolivian Amazon. And first, I'd like to point out some theoretical frameworks that we're operating or we're using, basic assumptions. That environments have long, complex, dynamic human histories, all of them. And I think we see many examples of that in this session. All environments are anthropogenic to some degree, and we bicker and argue about how much, but I think you'll see in the case of this environment, and similar to Michael Heckenberger's, it's quite substantial. History is also embedded in these landscapes as physical remains, and as an archaeologist, I have to work off of the stuff that's out there. And so we treat it like we would any kind of artifact. We look for patterns, continuities, disjunctures, and we have a number of important tools that I'll be showing you as we go along. Also, from the insights of the new ecology, that healthy environments need to be sort of shaken up periodically, disturbed to maintain this, and humans are the best factor throughout the world to do this, although the threshold sometimes crosses over into possibly the negative. Now, another thing that we do is we apply the concept of landscape and the archaeology of landscape. And this allows us to go back much farther than the kinds of historical records that many of you are working with or ethnographic accounts. You might get back 100 years, 200, possibly longer in certain areas of the world. But with the archaeological record, we can essentially go back thousands of years, sometimes with quite fine resolution. Then these signatures of human activities can be ephemeral. They can be little pathways here and there that might be hard to detect. But in many cases, if you know what you're looking for and are willing to spend the time, sometimes you have to develop new techniques, the stuff is all out there, where people circulated. So you can tell who interacted with who by what's connected. All kinds of signatures of everyday life. And then there are a number of important concepts that we use to interpret landscapes, and one is an important concept of palimpsest, which we've heard several times in a number of the talks, and you'll see this in a few minutes of these incredible patterns embedded on the landscape. Also things like landscape or landes capital, which is a sort of multi-generational improvements that people put on their lands and pass it down through generations to succeeding peoples. Also, another concept, I consider this to be an example of domestication of landscape. And I'm interested here in the non-genetic alterations to improve resources that essentially people want. And in this creation and management, and I prefer those terms to some of the other terms we've been hearing of transformation and a lot of sort of culturally laden with all kinds of baggage terms. But I think in most cases, at least with Amazonian peoples, they knew what they wanted to do and they did it. Now, Mike gave us a nice introduction to the Amazon and all of the various sort of schools of thought and the history of ideas about the Amazon and how it's shaped our ideas today. And so I won't dwell on that. I just want to point out a couple of points that maybe emphasize something that he didn't emphasize quite as much, is the predominance of slash and burn agriculture throughout the Amazon and many parts of the world that we sort of assume to be some kind of age-old primitive system that goes way, way back in some evolutionary scheme. But William Denevan has shown us that most likely because of the difficulties of clearing land with stone axes, that it may have actually been invented with the arrival of Europeans and their trade goods. But there are all kinds of implications of this idea that with Swidden agricultures, you know, you've got to move around the landscape, you can't sustain large populations, the kind of things that Mike was showing you the other day, so something else has to be going on here. Another argument was that the lack of protein, and in many tropical areas of the world, and some areas of Amazonia, protein can be quite scarce, and they didn't have the domestic animals to sustain these populations, except for the dog and the Muscovy duck. So they got their protein other ways, and we found out a lot of this from ethnography, ethnobotany, and some archaeological studies, other sources of protein. And as Mike showed you, in the historical records, going way back to eyewitness accounts, also ethnography, especially from places like the Colombian Amazon that you see here, and archaeological research, such as Michael Heckenberger's, we now show that sort of this old view is not tenable anymore. There's an incredible rich archaeological record from traditional sites, and many of these from burial sites that produce these incredible ceramic objects for various parts of the central and lower Amazon. And most of these peoples were canoe peoples. And today, you can find groups that don't have canoes for various reasons. And many of the existing groups that ethnographers encountered were far from rivers, so they had no use for canoes. But we know through our reconstructions and also through a lot of the eyewitness accounts, most Amazonian societies, especially the ones that Michael and I deal with, are canoe peoples. And so this opens up an incredible opportunity for people to share ideas, socially interact, and we'll see this on a more regional scale in a few minutes. And also the linguistic data that Mike Heckenberger also talked about tells us something about this incredible movement of people's ideas, diasporas, and also adopting languages, probably as trade languages and things like this, creating an incredibly complex situation. I work on savannas, and savannas tend to get kind of a bad rap. There's not many supporters out there or advocates of savanna landscapes. And you think about landscapes like this, treeless, and then comes all kinds of connotations of a homogeneous landscape with no biodiversity or very low biodiversity. And I have a hard time talking, even my close colleague friends, who are botanists, to come out and study these kinds of landscapes for various complex reasons. The landscape today preserves some of what was going on in the past, but you'll see it's changed quite a bit. This is the northeastern quadrant of Bolivia, bordering on Peru and Brazil. And the lighter area there is the Llanos de Mojos, the plains of Mojos, in the department of the Beni, and some of it extends up into the Pando region. And then surrounded by that darker green, which is continuous canopy forest, something you don't see in a lot of areas of the Amazon today. And then snakes of sort of little curvy lines of green that are the gallery forests along some of the smaller and larger rivers. As Michael said, one of the dominant groups in these areas, and they sort of tend to get credit, possibly in the case of this situation, undue credit for some of these works, but the Arawak groups in many of these communities still exist, and many of them control a lot of the landscapes, some of the landscapes that we'll be talking about. Flying over it, it's not all savanna. It's a complex of wetlands and changes throughout the year. You have the gallery forests and the small forest islands that we'll talk about in a minute. And then 6 months of the year, the savanna is underwater. It could be several inches or it could be several feet, and even deeper along some of the major rivers. El Nino this year caused a lot of flooding and destruction of some of the urban areas. But even in this sort of pastoral landscape here out of the window of a Cessna, you can see some features like a straight line here, some grid work down there. This is a savanna that's maintained by fire, and it wouldn't exist unless it was systematically burned every year. And we see some very interesting patterns of areas where the missions that were established by the Jesuits failed. And in those areas, you can sort of look at the dots and kind of have them timed on a map. And you can see that those are the areas where the failed missions is usually where people stop burning and the forest has appeared. Some examples of a very, very sharp boundary. And I refer a lot about sort of where does the forest begin and where does something else begin. And in this case, in many of the areas that you'll see, it's an incredibly sharp boundary between the savanna and the current forest. Now, there are many different earthworks, and I wasn't the first to discover these. My colleague William Denovan was an early pioneer, and Oranjeskjold and others. But we were some of the first archaeologists to sort of systematically try to address the issues of who built them, what were they used for, and all sorts of just basic archaeological questions. Here you see settlement mounds, causeways, canals, forest islands, raised fields, fish weirs, reservoirs, and ring ditch sites. And I'll talk just very briefly, introduce you to some of these as context. These are raised fields, and raised fields there's some groups throughout the world that still practice this and use them, but in most cases have been abandoned. They're raised platforms so that you can plant in these seasonally flooded areas. Has all kinds of implications for accumulation of organic matter and green manure in the canals that can be periodically scraped out of the canals and put on the fields to sustain production in these extremely poor savanna soils. It also creates an incredible terraforming of the earth. You have a sort of this flat savanna landscape, and then you make ups and downs on it. It's like corrugated landscape where you have this tens of, probably millions of ecotones between terrestrial and aquatic that are produced. We've done a number of experiments with our project and some Bolivian agronomists that shows the dramatic difference between the two seasons. The dry season, when water can actually get scarce, and in this area that floods very deeply, the same field 6 months later in platanos and also manioc. Some of the experiments done by my agronomy colleagues from the National Agronomy University gave us all kinds of information about the carrying capacity of these, how many calories could be produced, and whether or not they're sustainable. Another feature that ties all this together is an incredible network of ruler straight roadways that crisscross the landscape. The roadways are raised earthen platforms, and so the earth was scraped up from beside it, creating a canal, which serves sort of double purpose. There are so many of these that some of my informants say, well, everybody had their own road. And we've mapped probably over about I think it's 5,000 linear kilometers of them just in one small area. And this shows a parallel ones that are showing up as dark lines because of the trees growing on them, sort of somewhat protected, as you'll see in a minute. And you can see how these would work. These are natural forest islands. I'll show you some artificial ones in a minute. And you can see the straight roadways connecting them like almost like a nerve network of these connections that go across the landscape, connecting everyone. This is a drawing from Dan Brinkmeyer, who's done a lot of visualizations of these to kind of make them come alive. So you can see here that you could haul these heavy canoes or paddle them or pole them in the canal most of the year probably when these were functioning. And you can load these things up with a metric ton or two of produce and very easily move that across the landscape. Also people connecting the settlements in diverse locations. And much like what Michael Heckenberger showed us, a very different pattern, but Amazonian peoples are social peoples, and it provides incredible opportunities to visit your neighbors, to structure things possibly in ways other than hierarchy that Michael was talking about. And people can also go long distances to get their firewood, to go hunting, and even have their fields long distance with this kind of communication network. We're also interested in how these systems kind of come together, and they overlap considerably. For instance, you have causeways, that you see in the middle there, combined with raised field agriculture. And so we started to look at these not simply as modes of transportation, but as hydraulic works. And so those of you familiar with tropical landscapes, riverine landscapes, you have river levees. If you connect two river levees that are high ground together, you can back up on a flat landscape incredible quantities of water. And one of the goals here was probably to capture the early rainfall, hold it so you can run your canoes across these savannas, start your agriculture early, and hold it longer into the dry season so you can extend your season. And then this has all kinds of implications I can't get into now. We're doing models of this sort of ponding and pooling of water, and when one of these blocks of fields gets too full of water, they can drain it off into the next block, and incredible regional scale hydraulic works. And then all this sort of comes together, and some of the maps that we've been doing where this current project is to sort of trace out a lot of these roads, similar to what Mike's doing on the Brazilian side. And you can see the sort of mass of different kinds of classifications of roadways. And I had a student that was playing around with network analysis, and you can actually, by indices of centrality and connection, you can play around with sort of which of the forest islands here that are connected is the most central. And we thought it would be right in the middle of this, but it's actually way down there on the edge, and it seems to be another one up here. So we're actually probably not dealing with one single unit, but possibly two. And then another thing, the issue of protein, and this was mentioned in Mike Heckenberger's paper also, the use of fish weirs. And in this case, these are earthen fish weirs, which are quite rare throughout the world. Just low little causeways that zigzag across the landscape. And you can put nets and baskets and things on the openings, probably set it up in the morning, come back in the afternoon, and you have maybe several kilos of fish. Very passive system, and these aren't big, giant, tasty Amazonian fish. They're these little armored catfish, but still important for people's living on these landscapes. Where do the people live? Okay, well, some of these are very, very large settlements that were used for thousands of years. These are the monticulos or lomas, these large earthen structures representing occupation after occupation after occupation. Some of them were used periodically for burial, cemeteries, but most of the evidence seems to indicate intensive occupation. Have sites that aren't mounds but are quite extensive, extending sometimes for a kilometer along a riverbed, and we've got a lot of these that are just eroding out of the riverbed, so they're very easy to study in profile. This looks like gravel on a beach, but this is actually potsherds. Now, forests, okay, well, so it's not all savanna, and most of the things, the features I've shown you are in the savannas. And we always sort of expected, well, you know, you can't have raised fields under trees, so why work in the forests? You know, and I'm not interested really in the archaeological sites. I'm a landscape archaeologist, so we use these things to kind of get out of the sun during the day, but I have other colleagues that are working on those. This is a typical forest island, usually round, oval, sometimes they're irregular shape. You see some cows there in the distance, and you can see some water accumulating around the edge of it, which indicates that probably it's artificial. Now, some of these are old levee formations that were probably colonized by early inhabitants and then enhanced by bringing up soil and raising them to form a dry platform for a small hamlet, household, or maybe even a small village. Every single one of these that we've probed, and we just got tired of doing it, but all my colleagues say, oh, maybe they're natural and they're not artificial, so we put a probe into it or do an excavation like this, and every single one has been chock full of potsherds and broken bone and, you know, all the kinds of things you'd expect for settlements. And there are thousands of these across the landscape. And a recent sort of estimate, doing some sampling, there were supposedly 10,000 of these existed in the department of the Beni. Dan Brinkmeyer did a little reconstruction here of what one of the larger settlements might have been like, a raised structure, and many of these connected by grand avenues or causeways to their neighbors. Now, one of the things that, you know, I'm a Savannah person, so we're out there like mad dogs and Englishmen in the hot sun. Everybody thinks we're nuts. And we take our lunch break, and so we look, okay, where's a tree on this vast line? Oh, there's a little patch of trees over there. So we go over, and we sit down, and we're just burned out. And then after lunch, I'm looking around, and well, wait a minute, we're sitting on raised fields in this forest. And I didn't think much of it, because it's, you know, close to the savannah, so there's a little bit of encroachment here and there, back and forth. But then I started going back further and further into the forest, and you see these rows of trees growing on raised fields. One of our study sites is this vast forest here called the Chimane Forest, which I think until recently was some of the highest biodiversity in Bolivia. Come back in with a forester who had found earthworks here, some 40 kilometers from the nearest savanna today. Tree falls full of potsherds, all kinds of causeways and things that we could easily map on his survey transects, and blocks of raised fields in these. We also have reports of one that's another 80 kilometers in what everyone assumed to be pristine forest has never been touched. Lots of mahogany, things like this. Just some examples of some other formations is these are raised fields out in the savannah, and you can see the white surfaces on Google Earth, and then you see these trees that are starting to colonize. And what's happening here is the creation of this up and down surface. You have water and canals, even though they're filled in a lot of times. And so the wind blows the fire across this landscape, and it stops there. Sometimes it leaps across and burns. So it gives those plants a chance to start, those saplings, seedlings, and stuff. And then over time, you get these incredible linear formations as they're protected from the regular burns. And then you have this protected area, and the forests will grow. But they're highly structured. Let's see. And then another feature that you've heard about in two of the earlier talks yesterday are ring ditches, which is a very popular theme these days. These are strange earthworks, circular. Sometimes we have some D-shaped ones. Many of the ones we found this summer are fairly irregular. And you can get a sense of how big they are, sort of the ditch of one of them. some of the mapping work. And one of the exciting things is that we got back into these forest islands near populated communities. And these are areas where the local people have saved these areas for agroforestry. And every time we started to look around us, to look around, this is one of the interpretations. Every time we started to look around, chocolate. And we go a little bit further, chocolate. And then you almost fall into the ditch. And it was this incredible, spooky relationship between these strange ditches and chocolate. Now, people think that they're possibly used as forts, like this possibly, and there's some eyewitness accounts of the Jesuits. But we're now thinking that these are probably very, very highly valuable areas of agroforestry that they're surrounding with these ditches to mark them off as valuable community property. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are some questions. Could you? Okay, well then shout.
Are you the source of Charles Mann's book, 1491?
He's the source.
What do you think of it?
He's the author. No, but I'd actually like to comment on that because that's that book is an award-winning book. It's read by many people. It's been translated in other languages, and it really is, I think, just a wonderful essay about all the incredible achievements and intellectual engineering works, knowledge and stuff of Native peoples of the Americas, including these kinds of things. In Dutch too?
Any other questions? Well, if I may, I'd like to ask a question. Since I work in Varzea, I was wondering what kind of water floods this area. I assume these aren't silt-laden waters like you get in the Varzea.
It's a very strange environment where the Varzea and terra firma, or the uplands, doesn't apply here because it's essentially a huge floodplain that covers most of the northeast part of Bolivia. But the water comes from very heavy rainfall, and it's very flat, waterlogging in the soils, the local soils, and also flooded rivers that go over their banks into these areas, filling them. And the rains are usually pretty predictable, although you can't always say how high the water is going to be each year. And along the main rivers, the sort of the whitewater rivers, you have huge sediment loads, especially from all the erosion in highland Bolivia and Peru today. And some of that is a lot of it's deposited along those main channels. But as you get further back, a lot of these are, I guess, sort of be clear water rivers that come out of swamps and things and don't have a huge flow. And most of the water that goes out into these areas where you find the raised fields is almost sterile.
Because in the Varzea, the idea is to get your agricultural areas actually flooded, the thing, and which is different from here. Thank you. Another question, James?
Thanks. James Fairhead from University of Sussex. Obviously a fascinating presentation, especially the extent of these earthworks in what is currently forest land, which I hadn't picked up at all before. But you say there are inhabitants in this landscape, a few now, but not very many. Do they have any history about the encroachment of that forest onto the savanna lands? And do you have any sort of dating that might enable you to understand the transformation of that open agricultural land to forest?
The ranchers are certainly concerned about it, and that's the main use of many of the open savannas today, and it is an issue. There are lots of different factors of sort of how those things get covered with shrubs and things, and some of it's due to the cattle themselves. In other cases, it's other processes. The local, also the local communities usually know it too, but in Bolivia, these communities tend to move around a lot, so they're not necessarily rooted to particular areas for long periods of time, although that's becoming more the case now. But we have also the same sorts of resources that you have. We have aerial photographs going back to the 1950s and all the kinds of things that you can use for change detection, which shows in some areas very dramatic changes of forestation, but very patterned.
There are no, one more, or are you coming up next?
You didn't say anything. Is that okay?
Well, you're going to speak next. No, David, sorry. No, sorry.
Monica Janowski, University of Sussex. I just wondered what the connections were, if any, between the peoples that are living there now and what you found there, whether you've been able to talk to them about the methods that were used for using the landscape, whether there's any connections at all, or whether this is just a completely past use system.
Well, archaeologists would always love to tie the remains to some cultural group or linguistic group, and it also is fraught with lots of dangers. I think Mike has a nice continuity in his case, but this is like a Tower of Babel of different language groups that are occupying these landscapes here, and I'm a little cautious about trying to assign, this to a present group. And a lot of the local scholars sort of speak generically of this. The locals, I'm always asking about them, and they're aware of the roadways because they sometimes use the old ones. They're aware of the canals, they use them, but very little interest or in the raised fields. And when we did our experiments, some of the older people came up to me and said, I've never seen manioc growing in the savanna before, and we had this bumper crop in the experimental fields that we showed. And there's also this, in other parts of the Americas, sort of the myth of the mound builder, where there's this kind of upper class looking down on native peoples, and when you talk about engineering works and all this incredible hydraulic knowledge, that they deny it, that there's a tie to the local peoples, and they explain it by a race of giants that occupied this landscape.
Okay, perhaps this could be the last question.
I had two real quick questions. One is, can you date this? I'm just wondering what kind of dates you're talking about, if it's a range of time or if it's just really is right before Columbus arrived. And the second is, all these, and maybe this is actually to all the archaeologists who are here that are talking about this kind of material, it just so totally transforms the ideas around obviously around population density and so on. And I'm wondering if you've tried putting numbers at all on the kinds of populations that were supported in these environments, and then connecting those back to what those environments really looked like in those moments. I'm sure you've done this kind of thing, but not being an archaeologist, I don't know of it. But it'd just be interesting information to throw out in this group.
So sort of three questions. I'll try to answer very briefly. The first one, what does this date to? Seems like the earthworks come in and out of use, but most of them, the majority of the dates are somewhat late, prehistory, and we even have some fish weirs that might have been used into the sort of proto-historic period before the Jesuits arrived in this area. But the earliest we have goes back to about, I think it's 800 BC, so almost 3,000 years ago, the earliest earthwork. And it's construction of a causeway in the savanna. Then in terms of populations, that's a question everybody asks. And I used to sort of make up figures, because we have some figures on calories that can be produced in the fields, and you can calculate that and sort of, carrying capacity. Denovan, who I trust, argued 100,000 people would have lived in this sort of general area, but he only looked in the savannas, and now we know all this stuff is under the forests and stuff too, so it could be double, triple that, and we really don't know. But I don't want to give the impression that the whole landscape was densely populated. There are areas that were probably low population. The third thing, what did it look like? Very few trees in the past, and any trees that were on that landscape were tended in gardens, house gardens, and little woodlots and things. I'm convinced that there were very few trees.
Okay, one more question, just because she's unstoppable, so we might as well let her go. But it's got to be short. It's got to be short.
It's going to be very short. I was curious if you want to speculate on the relations of these systems with animal systems, because even though we think that animals are quite discrete, that's perhaps due to the geopolitics of the 19th century and less to prehistoric stuff.
Well, raised fields are found in 8 or 9 places throughout South America. The Maya used them, the Aztecs used them, the Chinampas are a former race field, and they're even found up here in northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin, very small scale ones. And everybody, a lot of sort of diffusionist types like to see some kind of a common origin spread, and I think it's just a common response of smart farmers to conditions. But what's interesting is that these are farmers that specifically selected areas that we would not select: swamps, marshes, wetlands, flooded areas, and they saw those as not as marginal lands but as optimal lands.
Great. Thank you very much.